Welcome to GIT 250, Introduction to Commercial Print, Lecture 1. Today's lecture is going to be an introduction to the printing industry. We'll cover some of the history of printing, talk about the industry itself, some of the categories that make up the industry, what do we mean when we talk about print as an industry, what does that involve? Then we're going to go over a little bit of the terminology related to that industry and talk about some of the service categories and different types of companies that are out there. We'll get into the technology and the processes a lot more in depth down the road, but today we'll start off slowly. So first up, some of the history of printing, and as the slide indicates, this is a brief history of print. It's very brief. These are interesting topics. If you want to dig in a little bit deeper, you can look up some of the history of print and find there's a lot of information out there. In terms of history as a study, print has a pretty big role in the history of communication of information and ideas and industrial revolution, Renaissance, all that kind of stuff. So take a look into that if it's something of interest to you. For our purposes, this is about as deep as we're going to get into it. I started a long time ago. It went on for a long time. In around 1440, you guys are familiar with the Gutenberg press and some of the things that took off as a result of that printing revolution. And we're going to pick it up with where printing is today. We're not going to really dig in much into the history of it. I'm not going to go through these bullet points with you. You can look all that up. Wikipedia has a pretty good timeline if you're really curious as a starting point. But yeah, history of print is interesting, but this is about as far as we're going to go today. What we're more concerned with is where print is now and what it's used for and how that affects you in your careers or the different types of fields that you may work in. So the purpose of print is to communicate ideas. Typically that involves putting those ideas on paper and then distributing or disseminating those ideas that way. The reason for putting those ideas can be pretty varied. It's really whatever you want to use it for. Traditionally, that's to inform, persuade, entertain, or convince, or whatever. So all those things fit in printing. The reasons that you would want to do it are as varied as the different ways that you can do it. We're going to look at basically how to do it and let you guys figure out why or what you want to do with it on your own. So there's a lot of psychology that's been done, a lot of studying that's been done into the psychology of print or the neuroscience of print or the neuroscience of touch specifically. There's a reading assignment this week where you get to look into that a little bit more in depth. There's a PDF. It's 30 or so pages long with a lot of pictures. It's easy reading. But it goes into the neuroscience of touch and talks about how printing affects people a little bit differently than digital content. When we consume things digitally, it affects us a little bit differently than printed. So print is tangible. It's credible. It's physical. And you have a connection to it that you don't have with digital content. There are studies confirming this. I'm a little biased personally. I think print is pretty great in terms of getting information across. I read a lot of books, but I read them all digitally just because it's so much easier. So I go both ways. I like digital content. Obviously, I like printed content too. There is a place for both. This class isn't to say that print is better than anything else. It's just another tool that you need to have in your toolbox to be familiar with. Today, the main thing that we're going to talk about is what you see on this slide here, the printing service categories. These can have different names. There's different ways of classifying this. These aren't set in stone, but it's a good way to think about the different categories that make up the printing industry. So the top four specifically is what we're going to look at. There's commercial printing. So first off, let's go through commercial and then we'll come back to that list. So commercial printing is done by a wide range of different companies that do all kinds of different things. It's pretty varied. So you can end up as a commercial printer servicing government entities, large enterprises, small businesses, offices, private individuals, whatever. You can do all kinds of things for them: stationery, brochures, collateral, marketing materials, packaging, whatever it is. That list is very brief and it can go on and on and on and on. Commercial printing that is, has to do with what the purpose of the printing is, really, more so than what it is being printed. So if you look at the word commercial, the root of that is commerce. So anything that's done for commerce can be considered commercial printing, but printing that's done in a commercial environment or for commercial purposes, that's commercial printing. So It's a pretty broad definition, obviously, and that's really what it is. Commercial print is very broad. Moving on, we have packaging printing. Packaging printing is tremendously set for growth right now and has been growing like crazy. There are a lot of opportunities for package designers, package creators, testers, printers, and all kinds of things related to the package printing industry. Everything that you consume, that you buy at the store or shop for, has been packaged in some shape or form. Look around yourselves. Take 5 minutes and look around in your house, in your pantry, in your kitchen, whatever. Go to the store, walk down the aisles, and you'll see that every single thing in there has been packaged in some way, whether it's shrink wrap or complex carton or package to the fancy box that your Apple laptop came in. All that's packaging. And that's huge as far as the print industry. That's a large part of the printing industry. Publishing printing, that's a category of print that is on the decline a little bit. You may have heard the expression that print is dead. And when you do your reading and read that document, the website with the infographic, print is big, you'll see that that's not the case. Print isn't dead, but it is changing. The traditional outlook on printing was publishing printing was where printing was. That's what printing was, is newspapers on giant presses and things like that. Books, textbooks, magazines, those kind of things are all on the decline. There are tons of newspapers that only have digital versions now. There are lots of magazines that have gone out of print. And like I said before, I read all my books digitally on the Kindle or Nook or whatever else. And publishing printing is really on the decline. There are still a lot of publishing printers out there, but not nearly the scale or scope that it used to be. So yeah, that's one area of printing that is definitely on the decline right now. In-plant printing is, again, not so much what is being printed, but where. So a facility that is owned by a business or a company and its purpose is to serve that company, then that's an in-plant printer. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the physical location, but it's owned by by that company that it's servicing. So, for example, here at ASU, we have the Print and Imaging Lab, which is just across the hall from my office. And they do a lot of the printing for the university, business cards, brochures, calendars, all kinds of different things. They're done large format banners and wall wraps and graphics, whatever they can do, you name it. They're doing it for the university. They're a separate entity within the university, but they serve the university as their pretty much the sole client. So that's an in-plant facility. There are others. One of the largest in the nation is the GPO, the Government Publishing Office. They recently changed their name. It used to be the Government Printing Office. And as you can imagine, the U.S. government has a lot of printed content, all the documents, forms, brochures, informational packets, and whatever else that the government puts out for Congress or for national parks or any branch of the government. That was handled and is handled by the Government Publishing Office. That's an enormous in-plant printing facility with multiple locations. I say facility pretty broadly. It's a lot of different spots. But anyways, so there are some benefits to that. One is that you don't have to try and find a contractor who is able to take on your jobs. And in turn, they're going to mark it up and they're going to make a profit on it, which is understandable. You can avoid that by having an in-plant print facility. However, there are drawbacks to that too, of course. You have overhead of your own staff, the resources, equipment, liability. You have to have enough need to make it worthwhile too. So an in-plant facility is just any print facility, print shop that runs inside of another organization to serve that organization. Trade shops. These are this is a unique kind of business. I'm sure there's other industries that have their own types of trade shops in printing. Those are businesses that service the printing industry. So specialty equipment or jobs that can't be done in a more traditional or generalized print facility would be handled at a trade shop. So for example, I'll use the ASU Print Imaging Lab continuously throughout this class. You'll get familiar with it pretty much, and we have some videos that you'll watch later on too. But for example, they aren't big enough to do every single type of job that's out there that might come across them as a request. Rather than turning away work, a traditional printer will hire out a trade shop, or they'll subcontract parts of a job out to a trade shop to get things done that they can't do. For example, if a client approached the print shop here at ASU and wanted to do UV coating, which is a specialized coating we'll talk about much later when we get into finishing, they can't do that here. So they would send that job out to a trade shop who is going to do that work for them, send it back to ASU, and then bill ASU for it. And then ASU would mark that up and bill the client. That's what a trade shop does. Special purpose shops typically do a limited type of printing, similar to a trade shop, but not quite the same thing. Typically, they're going to be working for not just print service providers, but the general public or other businesses or whatever. But typically they do one thing, and that's what their specialty is. You don't see it much anymore, but carbon copy. Some of you may be familiar with carbonless paper. You write on the top sheet, you keep the gold one for yourself, you turn in the pink one to the DMV, that kind of stuff. That carbon copy was a huge industry that, again, that's not an industry, but that was a big field in the printing industry that's kind of gone away. Those carbonless forms aren't such a big deal anymore, but a company that specialized in just that was a special purpose shop. But there are other businesses that do especially label printing or business forms, or they do older styles of printing like letterpress, for example, which we'll talk about that all later too. Don't worry about what it is now. But any company or business that does that specialty printing would be a special purpose shop. Print on demand is not so much a type of company, but just a type of a procedure within the printing industry. Examples of companies that do print on demand would be Shutterfly. Many of you might be familiar with Shutterfly. They do calendars and coffee mugs and mouse pads and books and all kinds of things like that. You can order prints online. You upload your photos, they print it, and then they mail it out to you. So it's print on demand. It's web to print. You put an order in over the web, they print it, and they ship it to you. Blurb, they specialize in books, full color coffee table, photo books, recipe books, that kind of thing. Vista Print, those of you that remember Kinko's print shops, Alpha Graphics, those are all some examples of print on demand type places. Another word for those, or another name for those, are quick print shops, or just a copy shop. If someone says copy shop, then that's typically what they're talking about sometime if it's a walk-in business. They specialize in shorter runs. Typically, you're not going to be doing 50,000 copies of a direct mail piece at a place like this. You're going to be doing 10 copies of a poster that you're going to put up for an event, or you're going to be doing a variable data piece, customized calendars that you're going to send out to your real estate clients or things like that. So typically the clients of these print on demand or quick print shops are not going to be huge companies. It's more likely going to be small businesses or individuals. And then another huge part of the print industry that makes it so big are all the related industries. Print doesn't run on its own. Obviously, there's a lot that has to go into it. A large component of the print industry is paper. Obviously, paper comes from somewhere, so that goes back to paper companies, which goes back to logging industry, recycling industries, shipping is all huge. So up on the top, there's some copy paper. If you look close at the logo, some of you might recognize that. On the bottom, that's an example of a paper mill, the paper coming out of a paper mill, large roll of paper that's going to be shipped out in train cars and things like that to large printing facilities. Ink producers, we have a couple of them here in the Valley. ASU just went through a redesign or a rebranding of its ink colors and has its own spot colors now. We'll get into that much later, but we worked with a local ink producer here in the Valley to create specific to ASU maroon and gold colors of ink that can be used for consistency across all different kinds of printing. There's companies that manufacture presses like Komori or Heidelberg. You may have heard of some of those names. Man Roland, lots of others, obviously. Color management, consulting, software development and design, and implementation of specific software tools for the print industry. Lots of equipment, facilities, protocols, everything that goes into that. And then there's the design component, which some of you may be more interested in, just doing the graphic design for print, which is a whole different thing too than web design. Obviously, you probably are aware of that already, but print design is a little bit different than web design. So there are a lot of related industries to print. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into it, and that's why it's so big. So if you're going in order here in the lesson and Blackboard, then you haven't got to the Print is Big website yet. But when you do, pay attention to some of the dollar values and the sizes and scale of the print industry. It's really tremendous. Okay, so just as a simple reminder on kind of how print goes, and this is pretty generic to any kind of communication, you identify a need for it. Obviously, print is expensive. It can be expensive. It's not like posting on social media. You have to pay for every instance of this that gets distributed or seen by a client or an end user. And so you have to have a valid need for it in order to make a good business decision. And then you create your image design through a graphic designer or whatever process. You reproduce that based on the technology and the technique that's going to give you the proper results for whatever your message is. And then you have to distribute that somehow. So pretty simple printing cycle, something to keep in mind. As a review, here are the key terms that you're going to want to be pretty familiar with that we covered today in this lecture. You may want to do some additional reading on this. There are lots of resources online. As we go along, we'll get more in depth with this. You'll have some reading assignments given to you. But for now, this is pretty simple and light this week. You want to be familiar with commercial printing and what that entails. Packaging, publishing, in-plant, trade shops, related industry, specialty shops, those kind of things that we covered before. So as long as you're good on those terms, then what I'd really like you to do is take some time and look around yourselves. Go out to some shops, maybe just walk around a bit. Look around at what you have available to you and try to identify some of the types of things that are out there that are printed, and pay attention to just how much printed content is around you. You'd be surprised when you really think about it that a lot of times some of the things you may not realize are printed actually are, like the laminate wood of your furniture or the wallpaper in your house, or even some of the carpet that goes down can be printed. There are applications for printing coming down the road that are pretty exciting, like printed electronics, LED panels that will go up like wallpaper and plug in. There's a company here in the Valley that's developing a electronic credit card that has a light in it. So when it scans your credit card, it lights up to, as a security feature and just a value add branding type of thing. So lots of stuff going into the printing industry, lots to be aware of. You may not realize quite how big printing really is. So make sure you do that reading and then jumping on the discussion board. If you have any questions, I'd like to see if you come up with any really interesting examples of things that you find that are printed that you didn't realize before or weren't aware of just how much printing there is around you nowadays.